crazy, right? Thailand. Beautiful beaches, temples, delicious food. But then you dive into the true crime and, well, it gets pretty dark pretty fast.
Oh, yeah. And that's what we're going to get into today. Like, some of Thailand's most notorious serial killer cases. I mean, we're talking about cases that span a whole century. It's wild stuff.
Definitely. We've got some really interesting material to cover today. So why don't we just dive in and get started with a case that it goes all the way back to 1918, the case of Boon Peng, sometimes called the original Iron Chest Killer.
Boon Peng. Oh, he's a fascinating figure, a Buddhist monk, but also this kind of charismatic figure. People knew him for making love potions and, maybe not the most holy pursuits.
Yeah, a real Jekyll and Hyde character, right? He used his position, as this monk to seduce and exploit women, even incorporating them into some of his rituals. And then there's the story of Prick, the young woman who got pregnant by him.
That's where things take a dark turn. Boon Peng was already arranging a better marriage for himself, more advantageous. So he decided to get rid of Prick. And I mean, in the most calculated way you could imagine.
It's terrifying. He suffocated her right and then sealed her body in an iron chest, weighted it down with bricks, and had it dumped in the Chao Phraya River.
Yeah. It's a detail that just sticks with you. I mean, when they found that chest and Prick's body, it shocked all of Bangkok.
I bet. It's like straight out of a movie. And the case unraveled so quickly, and Boon Peng was arrested, get this, at his own wedding.
That's wild, right? The irony. But the story gets even more shocking. During his confession, he admitted to another murder, a jewelry seller, and he got rid of the body the exact same way, in an iron chest.
Wow. It was like his signature move. That case really gripped the public, and it marked the end of an era because his execution, his public beheading in 1919, was the last public execution in Thailand.
Yeah. Gruesome end to a gruesome story. His case left a mark on Thai criminal history. Now, fast forward to the 1950s, a time of high political tension and social anxiety. And that brings us to the controversial case of Sequay, the so-called cannibal killer.
Sequay's story is really fascinating because it shows how much fear and prejudice can impact the case. I mean, he was a Chinese immigrant who arrived in Thailand in 1946 when anti-communist sentiment was incredibly high.
Yeah. And that context is so important to understand how things played out for him. People were looking for someone to blame, to embody all their fear.
So it all started in 1958 when a young boy disappeared in Rayong province. The boy's father claimed he found Sequay getting ready to burn the boy's body, and there were some organs missing.
It was a horrifying accusation, and at the time, with anxieties surrounding Chinese immigrants so high, it quickly spiraled out of control. And Sequay, he couldn't really defend himself well. His Thai wasn't very good, and he basically became the scapegoat, the face of all those fears.
Like a boogeyman, right?
Yeah.
Used to scare people and reinforce those prejudices. And as time went on, even more child murders were attributed to him. Many had similar claims about organs being removed. The media really ran with the story, portraying him as this monstrous figure preying on innocent children.
It was a media frenzy. And unfortunately, despite a lack of solid evidence and inconsistencies, Sequay was convicted and executed in 1959. His story became a cautionary tale, something parents used to scare their kids for decades.
It's a really tragic case. In recent years, there's been a push to re-examine his guilt. Elderly neighbors who knew Sequay, they testified that he was innocent, describing him as kind and helpful. They believe he was wrongfully accused and convicted, a victim of the political climate at the time.
It makes you think. And it's important to note that in 2020, Sequay's remains were removed from the medical museum where they'd been on display and given a proper burial.
Wow, that's a powerful gesture. It really shows how fear and prejudice can distort justice. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We're going to travel to the 1970s. The era of free love and backpacking. This is where we meet Charles Sobraj, also known as the Serpent, a real charismatic con man who turned into a serial killer.
Sobraj is fascinating because his story is like the opposite of Sequay's. He could blend in, was a master manipulator. He preyed on Western tourists, often pretending to be a gem dealer to gain their trust.
He's like a chameleon, right? Always changing his looks and identity to avoid getting caught. It's no surprise he earned the nickname the Serpent. His crimes spanned across multiple countries, making him one of the most internationally notorious serial killers of the time.
And his methods were disturbing. He'd often drug his victims and rob them, and in a few cases, he killed them. Some bodies were even found wearing bikinis, which earned him another nickname, the Bikini Killer.
That's so creepy. So in 1976, he was arrested in India and spent over 2 decades in prison there. But he was never extradited to Thailand to face trial for the murders he committed there.
Yeah, he was slippery. His story continues to fascinate people, and there's even a Netflix series called The Serpent that brought his case back into the public eye. It's a good reminder that there are dangers lurking everywhere, even in the midst of adventure and travel.
It's a reminder that evil can take many forms. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem harmless. Okay, so let's move into the early 2000s now. The case of Some Kid Pumpwan, a guy known as Kid the Ripper. This case raises some serious questions about rehabilitation, and the risks of releasing violent offenders back into society.
This one really gets to you because it shows how even the most seemingly reformed criminals can still have those darkest impulses.
So Some Kid's spree started back in 2005. Over several months, he killed 5 women in hotels across Thailand. He used different methods: strangulation, drowning. His crimes were brutal, seemed random, and just utterly terrifying.
Totally agree. He was finally caught and sentenced to life in prison. But here's where the story takes a turn. While he was locked up, Some Kid was considered a model inmate, participating in programs, and he even got his sentence reduced.
He was playing the system right, making everyone believe he was a changed man.
And it worked, sadly. In 2019, just a few days before his 55th birthday, he was released.
And that decision had devastating consequences. Within months, he killed again. He murdered his girlfriend in a way very similar to his previous victims.
It was a horrifying reminder that some criminals can't be rehabilitated despite how they might appear.
He was caught again, but this time there would be no leniency. He was convicted and sentenced to death. It's a chilling reminder that the justice system isn't perfect. Even with good intentions, mistakes can be made. It's really scary to think about, right? That people are capable of that level of premeditation.
And speaking of calculated, the next case involves a man named Narot Songkamhen, the pickup truck killer. His story shows just how powerful greed can be. Yeah. Nairt's case is interesting because of his method, his MO. It was really horrifying. So between 2011 and 2012, he targeted drivers, specifically those driving Toyota Vigo pickup trucks, because those were in high demand, on the black market.
I see. So he was after the trucks themselves.
Right. And his method, it was sinister. He'd hire these drivers to help him transport goods, and then on the road, he'd offer them coffee, but it was poisoned.
Wow. So cold-blooded, preying on their kindness.
Exactly. And after they died, he would dump their bodies, usually in remote areas, and then he'd sell the trucks.
It's just awful. He caused so much pain, so much loss, at least 6 confirmed victims, and 3 others who survived the poisoning attempts. But I can't imagine how terrifying that would be.
It's a miracle they survived. In the end, Nairt took his own life in prison in 2012. He was awaiting trial.
A dark end to a dark story. It really makes you think about the darkness that can hide inside people you'd never suspect. While we're talking about disturbing cases, maybe we should mention the one the media called the horny six-pack killer.
Oh yeah, that one. It's really a case of the media exploiting a tragedy, using sensationalism to get attention.
Definitely. We should always remember to look beyond the headlines and focus on the real harm that was done. So this case took place between 2010 and 2014. A contractor was arrested for raping 10 women in Bangkok, and he killed 2 of them. But instead of focusing on that, the media went crazy about the victims' ages. Most of them were elderly, and the fact that the guy was in good shape.
It became a spectacle, right? They completely missed the point.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to be critical of what you see in the media.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to a case that really shook Thailand in 2014. The story of a man known only as Nui. He was a drifter who targeted children in a series of incredibly brutal attacks. It shows that evil can really be anywhere.
Yeah. Nui's case is especially disturbing because of how vulnerable his victims were. And the attacks seemed so random.
In December 2013, he kidnapped a 6-year-old girl, her name was Cartoon, from a concert near Bangkok. There's this CCTV footage of him leading her away. It's a haunting image.
That poor girl. And then, days later, her body was found. It had been dismembered and dumped in a vacant lot.
It's unimaginable. And then it came out that this wasn't Nui's first crime. He confessed to other attacks on children, a pattern of abuse and violence that had been going on for years.
And what makes it even more disturbing is Nui's own past. He was abused and neglected as a child. He said he'd been raped repeatedly and that he started assaulting others when he was only 15.
It's a vicious cycle. It makes you think about how important early intervention is. Nui was sentenced to life in prison, but his story stays with you.
For sure. We need to be vigilant. We have to protect children and address the societal problems that lead to these kinds of things. Okay, so let's talk about a case that highlights the dangers faced by homeless people. people living on the edge of society.
You mean Jimmy the serial killer? The 20-year-old homeless man who preyed on other homeless people in Bangkok back in 2016?
That's the one. It's a reminder that violence can happen anywhere, even in communities that are already dealing with so much.
Jimmy's crimes were really brutal. He would slash his victims' throats, stab them, and even tie their hands together with wire. It's a level of violence that's hard to grasp.
Absolutely. He was caught sleeping near one of the crime scenes. His clothes were covered in blood. They linked him to the deaths of at least 5 homeless people.
It's a tragic reminder of the risks they face. Okay, so for our last case, we're going back to the Iron Chest Killer. But this time, it's not Boonpeng from 1918. This takes place in 2018 with Apichai Onwuzit, who they called Iron Chest Killer II.
It's kind of crazy, right? Like a twisted echo from the past.
Definitely. It shows how some patterns of violence repeat themselves. So tell me about Apichai.
Well, his story is steeped in violence. His own father was accused of murdering and dismembering a young girl, and then he was killed himself. And Apichai's mother, she fled the country.
So he was exposed to some truly awful things from a young age. It must have had an impact on him.
You have to think so. So in 2018, Apichai was released from prison. He'd been serving time for a string of violent crimes. He went back to his property in Bangkok, and that's when everything started to come out.
What happened?
Well, one of his former prison buddies, he tipped off the police. He told them that he'd helped Apichai bury a girl on the property.
Oh, wow.
The police went to the property and they found a bag. It was full of human body parts, and then they found the metal chest.
Just like Boonpeng.
Exactly. And inside, they found the body of Warren Thorne Chayashet, Apichai's girlfriend. She'd been brutally murdered.
That's horrible.
It gets worse. They found more bone fragments in one of his ponds. It makes you wonder if there are more victims out there. And there were even neighbors who reported a 12-year-old girl had disappeared years earlier. That case is still unsolved.
We may never know the full extent of his crimes. But his case, like all the ones we've talked about today, really leaves you with a lot to think about. It makes you question the nature of evil and how someone can become capable of such horrific things. It's like these cases, even though they happen so far apart, they have these weird similarities. It's almost like history is repeating itself. What do you think about that?
It is strange, right? It makes you think about evil. Like, is it something you're born with, something you learn, or is it just like a product of your circumstances?
Yeah. And looking back at all the stuff we talked about today, it's obvious that Thailand's serial killers, they don't all have the same motives. Their methods are different too.
Right, right. You've got guys like Nurut, just driven by pure greed, using poison to get those Toyota trucks to sell. And then there's someone like Sobraj. He loved the manipulation, the whole con man thing, tricking those tourists.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then some of them, it seems like their past just pushed them down this awful road. Like with Nui, confessing to starting so young with the rapes and murders, probably because of the abuse he suffered. It's hard to even think about.
It's complicated, right? You've got the person's individual psychology, but also societal pressures, and then just bad luck being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And what I find interesting is how these cases, despite how different they are, they kind of highlight some of the weaknesses within Thai society itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like how often the victims are young women, or how marginalized groups like homeless people are targeted. There's this theme of blaming outsiders, which was so clear in Siquei's case. It makes you think about some uncomfortable stuff, about how darkness can exist even in a country known for its beauty.
That's true. And while it's important to understand the cultural background, we can't forget that these guys, they made choices, terrible choices, that hurt a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Knowing their past might explain some things, but it can't excuse what they did.
Yeah. So, as we're wrapping up our deep dive into these really disturbing cases, what are some of the big takeaways for you? What should our listeners be thinking about going forward?
One thing that really stood out to me was how often poverty and lack of opportunity come up. A lot of these guys, they came from really rough backgrounds. It makes you wonder, what if there had been more support? Could some of this have been prevented?
It's a really good question. And you also can't ignore the violence against women. It comes up in so many of these cases.
Yeah.
From Boonpeng's first victim to Apichai's girlfriend ending up in that iron chest, just like the first case.
Yeah, it's creepy, right? That pattern. And I think we also have to acknowledge the role of mental illness. Now, it's never an excuse for hurting others, but recognizing it is important. Maybe it can help us figure out better ways to prevent these kinds of things.
You've made some really good points. And for everyone listening, I hope this encourages you to keep learning about this stuff The psychology of serial killers is fascinating, but also the specific challenges and complexities of crime in Thailand. It's worth exploring.
I agree. As you think about these cases, ask yourself, does knowing what these guys went through, their twisted way of thinking, does it make their actions any less disturbing? Or does it just raise more questions about what makes a human being capable of such terrible things?